Hello, my name is Taina Bieneme, and welcome to 28 Minutes, Issues that Matter to New York City and to the World. Today, we are having a conversation about the feminization of poverty in New York City and communities' efforts to address it. Does poverty have a woman's face in New York City? Is poverty inevitable, or should our city, state, and federal governments address poverty as an urgent public health crisis and human rights violation? What is the impact of poverty on women and their families, and what solutions do we have at our fingertips to address this growing crisis? With me today to help us answer these questions are two experts in the field and more. Ana Oliveira, President and CEO of the New York Women's Foundation, the largest women's fund in the country, which is now celebrating its 25th anniversary. Also with us is Ai-jen Poo, co-founder and director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Ai-jen spearheaded the campaign that led New York State's first domestic workers' Bill of Rights. And just this morning, we found out that she was named one of the 100 most influential people according to Time magazine. So thank you, Ai-jen and Ana. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll start with you, Ana. Yesterday, an article in the New York Times came out about the increase of poverty in New York City by 1.5% or 6%. And these are 2010 numbers. So there is a growing crisis. It probably has increased since 2010. Are we just talking about numbers? What do these numbers mean for us?
Thank you so much for having me, and I want to add my congratulations to Ai-jen for your just incredible, stellar leadership, and congratulations to Time for being able to recognize incredible leaders. What do increased poverty rates from a study in New York mean? On one level, we think it's really important that a mainstream newspaper like the New York Times talks about it and put those results out. On the other level, there's always a gap. There's a time gap and there is an information gap between the true lives of families, children, women, men, families, particularly families of color, living in poverty, and when the rest of the city and the country gets to hear about it. So what it means is that the recession and this very, very, very slow and complicated improvement, recovery, has really impacted and is really impacting a very large number of New Yorkers. When we hear that poverty rate is officially, according to the city, at 21%, we know that those numbers are, although very important numbers, they don't capture the whole sense of difficulty, economic difficulty that families live in. So for instance, to be considered poor in this indication, a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, would be about $30,000 a year. And we know that in New York City, it's already impossible to live, meets the daily needs just with that. So through the work of the foundation, when we hear from our grantee partners, this is like 70 organizations throughout the city, very, very close to the ground, is that women heads of households, and that's why kids' poverty increases so much. Kids don't live alone. Kids themselves are not part of the job market. The fact that they are very poor and children's poverty increased to 23%, it means that the households, their parents, are very poor, are not earning enough, do not have enough jobs, do not have opportunity to earn enough to lift up their families out of poverty. Mm-hmm. So it's of great concern to us. We estimate that among the poor, women and girls and boys, women and children, constitute about 78%. So that's a disproportionate burden and is an indication also of what the solutions are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because we know that poverty is simply a consequence of economic distribution. Mm-hmm. It is not an inherent characteristic of any society. It's not an inherent characteristic of any peoples, any communities. We can look around the world and we can see countries that are making enormous strides in uplifting millions and millions of their people out of poverty. Mm-hmm. New York City is not a resource-poor city. New York City is a very resource-rich city, and I mean that economically, intellectually, ingeniously, in terms of creative responses, in terms of mobilization of New Yorkers on behalf of New Yorkers. So we think that we have incredible opportunity to, when we hear that poverty rates have increased, we must galvanize and say, let's respond to that. Mm-hmm. Let's begin an overall concerted effort in which we reduce that.
Mm-hmm. So Ai-jen, speaking of galvanizing people, and these numbers are pretty frightening. 1 in 4 children being poor in New York City. The New York Times dubbed you as the Norma Rae for nannies. Obviously, your work goes beyond nannies. You've led a tremendous campaign that led to the first Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. Can you summarize that trajectory for us?
Sure. Well, for a long time, women who work as nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers have been undervalued, overworked, and highly vulnerable to abuse and to poverty. And I hear stories and have heard stories for over a decade about women who were not paid for years of work, people who were paid less than the minimum wage, people who work many hours over overtime hours who are not paid for those hours, people who are fired when they tell their employers that they're pregnant, or even for calling in for a sick day. Things like these kinds of abuses have been going on for a long, long time. And women started coming together and supporting each other around their experiences and seeking collective solutions to the problems that they face. And that work of coming together, organizing in all different communities, and the Asian community through CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, and Damayan Migrant Workers Association, and Adhikar for Human Rights. All of these organizations, Domestic Workers United formed to help women in the Caribbean and Latina communities. There's a way in which wherever there's exploitation and poverty, there's always going to be organizing and coming together for collective solutions. And that's what we saw with the Bill of Rights campaign. Workers standing up for each other and for a better future for all of us. And after 6 years of organizing and advocacy, domestic workers were successful in passing the very first Bill of Rights that establishes basic rights for domestic workers, the first state in the country. And we're moving on in California to do similar legislation and 4 more states next year. But I think it's one of the anti-poverty strategies that we have to expand labor rights, recognize this work of women that has long been unrecognized and undervalued, as well as support the advocacy of women who are helping us understand the kinds of changes, the kinds of policies we need to put into place for an economy that works for everyone.
What are the major provisions of the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights?
In New York, it established overtime protections, protection from minimum wage, and protection from discrimination and harassment, a minimum of 3 days paid leave per year. So now, in fact, domestic workers are the only workers in the state of New York who have legislated protection around paid leave. And it called upon the state of New York to do a study as to whether collective bargaining would be possible for this workforce in order to achieve more benefits that other workers enjoy, like paid holidays and paid vacation and health care. These are all very long held and valued anti-poverty strategies, right? Making sure that people have access to these benefits. So the fight is not over by any means. There's still much more to be done, and women are organizing and making change every day.
Well, the interesting thing here is you have exploitation, poverty, suffering, and community-based solutions. But then what is the role of the government? Is there a gap? The New York Women's Foundation did an analysis on the governor's budget of 2012-2013, which basically gutted so many programs that would have supported women and their families, and some say that it could lead to economic violence. It is actually a result of economic violence. So why the discrepancy, why the gap, and what can we do to close it?
I think that the opportunity that we have is the kind of collective organizing that Arjun is talking about, and the kind of the ability for community solutions, which are powerful and effective, to really rise to a proper size, to really be able to capture the attention of New Yorkers, as the work of domestic workers is capturing, as the work of other workers, the paid sick leave campaign, the living wage campaign. Those are very important campaigns. The role of government. The government, we're in a great national debate about the role of government. And we think that the role of government is to enable, to guard for the collective well-being of the country, of the city, of the state, in each of its dimensions. And in the city, we have, even in the city budget, we have cuts in child care, for instance. This is a time when single mothers, heads of households with children, those are the children that are increasing in their index of poverty, right? Those are the families that are slipping further and further into poverty, losing child care provided by the city. The state budget cuts, this year they were a little better than last year, but they did not restore the draconian cuts that hit women and their families from domestic violence, just about complete defunding of domestic violence, defunding opportunities for working mothers to have access to community colleges, defunding opportunities for folks that are leaving public assistance to be able to get a degree and earn more than $7 or $8 an hour. Really an attack, a multiple attack on women and their ability to succeed. So we think, what government also needs to be leading is a conversation about what kind of society are we creating? What kind of city are we creating? What kind of state, what kind of country are we creating when we don't use the ingenuity that we have, the resources that we have to have win-win propositions? We look around in the world, and New York has the opportunity to lead. New York has the opportunity to say, we see that in the case, the feminization of poverty, the burdening on women and single heads of households. We see that that's happening. Let's be ingenious at the state level, at the city level. Let's lead a conversation. What are the policies that we need to put in place that create a very vibrant city and state for most, if not all, of its people? It's really, we live in a concept that if people get out of poverty, somehow someone else is going to have less profit. We live in a concept that if people that are, don't succeed in school because they don't have supports, if families that lose their housing, if they get that somehow the rest of us are going to lose something. It is completely the opposite. The better everyone does, the better we all do. The better those that don't have access do, the better we all do, spiritually and materially. So I think part of the role of government is not just funding programs, and the government must fund safety net programs, programs that are jump starts in people's lives, programs that create opportunity for people to reroute themselves. Clearly that. But government has a responsibility for leadership as well, has a responsibility for galvanizing everyone in a mutually invested conversation. You know, we miss that. I think that that happens in some aspects, but it doesn't happen enough. And right now, when this comes out yesterday on the newspaper, we want to hear something from government. We want to hear an invitation to get IGEN, to get other community leaders, to get folks who are thinking about these problems for a long time, to get folks who are funding these problems. Let's come together and produce a different result in a year.
But we have to ask ourselves, is this an issue of constituency? I mean, a lot of the women you serve tend to be invisible in our society. When you look at the percentages of women in poverty, you're talking about mostly women of color, mostly a lot of immigrants among these women. So is this an issue of constituencies, really, and obviously you are organizing these women so that they have a voice, but you know, going further on the sort of bridging the gaps between community organizing and government responsibility. What are your thoughts?
Well, what's interesting about that is when I first started organizing, domestic workers were seen as a more invisible shadow workforce. But as time has progressed in New York City and the economy has taken the turn that it has, what we've started to realize is that the conditions that define the reality for domestic workers are increasingly defining the reality for every working person, not only women. The insecurity, the instability, the long hours, low wages, the devaluing of everyone's work is what's happening. And so it's not only about what works for domestic workers, it's actually about what works for all of us and the kind of economy we want for the future. And so I think that if politicians think that it's a question of constituency, if they just look around and see the reality, right, that 1 in 3 people is living at or near poverty in this country, there's a emergency for all of us, right, at hand. And it's not just the very poor, it's all of us.
Speaking of which, we can't do this work without money. The New York Women's Foundation is celebrating its 25th anniversary. Congratulations. I have to give a shout out for the Celebrating Women Breakfast on May 10th, at which IGEN is one of the honorees, I should say. But there seems to be also a major gap in philanthropy for women. New York City is a very rich city, and people with big hearts and deep pockets fund buildings, whether for hospitals or theater or education, the list goes on. And yet, here you are with a $6 million budget, and the New York Women's Foundation is the largest fund in the United States. How is that possible, and how can we increase philanthropy that really goes to the communities that IGEN serves?
First of all, let me acknowledge the incredible, women and men in New York that really choose to put their personal resources, their hearts, their time on behalf of others in New York. Philanthropy is more than the very wealthy. Philanthropy for us is really an act of civic engagement, just like participating towards passing a law or improving conditions, standing up in a full-fledged way and co-creating a world together, right? A better world together. So the foundation, we are very pleased that we're a community foundation. That's who we are. We are New Yorkers, women and families, boys and girls and men's foundations. But we do use very much of a critical, strategic, and value-oriented investing in women. And in ourselves as a destination, but also in ourselves as social and community agents. And that are underinvested and they are underleveraged. 25 years ago when the foundation began, it really, the number that we heard about specific investment for women in philanthropy was close to 3%. Just an appalling. And I'm going to say that although it's difficult to figure out exactly what it is now because there are many more funders, let's say that it's somewhere around 11. I'm just going to even say between 11 and 15. Just so that we don't leave anyone out, right? It's still an appalling low number. It reveals that first of all, our understanding as women and men of consciousness that it's so critically important to invest in women who are engendering, literally engendering solutions that come authentically from what they know, such as the work of Domestic Workers United, that come because they stay in a place in the world that is both where they are located and how they integrate others, and create that kind of solutions. There are win-win solutions. So philanthropy, is it's a huge phenomenon in the United States. It needs to be much bigger, but it needs to be bigger for social change. It needs to be bigger for social justice. We think arts, everything is important. Health, arts, that's all important. We love when public health programs are funded. We love when community clinics are funded. That's really important. But there's enough to also fund causes like Domestic Workers United, or women's entrepreneurship, or immigrants' rights, or domestic work organizing, or domestic violence and public violence work. There is enough. There is plenty of money in New York and in the U.S. to fund all those causes without having to defund the arts or education or health. We don't think it's a zero-sum game. What's happening in women's, we are investing this year $5 million in New York City. We're very proud to be there, but we're also very humbled for the degree of need that exists. So the foundation is able to fund at most a third of the groups that it would like to fund. So there is a gap between the vibrance of leadership that we could invest in and our resources. The authentic, incredible responses and work that is going on in New York that needs to be supported, that needs to become visible, that needs to be allowed to grow. So we don't have to be the only funders. By any means, we are not. We have incredible other women's funds who are incredible sisters, organizations, and partners. We also have other foundations that are very bold in funding women and girls as a priority, asserting their value and their leadership. But we don't have enough. And we also don't think that it has to be, to fund women, you don't fund men and boys. We don't think it's a zero-sum game. We were very proud to participate in Mayor Bloomberg's Young Men's Initiative because it's an everybody's issue.
That's right.
It's a family issue.
That's right.
And to that initiative, the understanding that boys and men also need gender-appropriate care and investment, just as women and girls need, just as communities of color need to be leveraged in their resilience, in their own traditions and values and responses. So this is another opportunity. We are a city foundation. Because of the wealth in New York City, New Yorkers are very generous to others, and we would like them to continue to be. The disproportionate distribution of wealth in the world is appalling as well. But we think that we have not taken enough care and enough thank you to the city that we all live in, because we benefit when workers make less. Unconsciously and unintentionally, we all benefit. We don't need that. We want workers to make more. We'll still live pretty well.
So in terms of leveraging, now that you are on Time's list of 100 most influential people, do you think that hopefully that will bolster your work, but also the role of social media? This is a very, very fast communications environment. How has social media helped you in your work? And you're going national as well, so has that contributed to your growth?
It has. I recently got on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. And we domestic workers have a Twitter handle. And I think that one of the things that the success in New York and the support of foundations like the New York Women's Foundation and all of the great organizing and sacrifices on the part of the many domestic workers who are part of our movement has done has given us visibility. And what we've been able to do with that visibility is launch a new national campaign called Caring Across Generations. And it's a campaign to make sure that every single one of our loved ones who's aging or who has a disability and who will need care and supports in order to live with dignity, and every worker who's responsible for that work, a domestic worker or home care worker, that they can do that work with dignity and with pride, living wages and benefits, and support their families. And so it's about creating new jobs. It's about making sure that those jobs are quality jobs and lifting us all, whether you're somebody who's a consumer and needs care or you're a worker and their families. And it's about a real solution that puts women at the center for a number of our nation's problems. Everything from the economy and jobs to immigration and training and economic opportunity. So that's what we'll be lifting up through social media, through the Time 100 process, and through the New York Women's Foundation breakfast that we're so excited to participate in. And we hope that everyone who's watching the show will come to a New York City Care Congress on June 3rd, right here in the city, and you can follow us on caringacrossgenerations.org.
That's great. Would you consider ever running for public office?
You know, I'm the person who runs people for office, so I would run a domestic worker for mayor first of the city of New York, and then maybe for president.
Well, that's great. And so, Anna,
We'll be right behind you.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, is the future a brighter one for women and their families in New York City?
It has to be. If we want the future to be a brighter one for New York, it has to be a brighter future for women and families in New York. So, but I think that what we need to have is a bolder future. We have, you know, I grew up in Brazil, and we always looked at the United States as having what we called pragmatic solutions, solutions that created ingenious responses to things unthought of before. So I think that something has happened that we are giving up. And I think it's time to just say, let's come back to the strength of being able to create new things. New solutions that others benefit, that all benefit. You know, the paradigm has to be a win-win paradigm. It cannot be a paradigm for a few at the cost of most.
Thank you so much, Ai-jen, Anna. This concludes our show for today. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please contact the New York Women's Foundation at www.nywf.org or the National Domestic Workers Alliance at www.domesticworkers.org. Until next time, this is Taina Bien-Aimé from 28 Minutes, Issues That Matter to New York City and to the World. Thank you for joining us, and do your part, however small, to make this world a safer place. Thank you.